The courtroom was buzzing with tension. People whispered to each other, glancing at the clock on the wall as they waited for the judge to arrive. In the middle of all this sat a tall man dressed in a sharp suit. His presence commanded attention. He stood out not just because of how he carried himself, but also because of his calm demeanor. He wasn't there as a lawyer or a witness. He had come to support someone close to him who was involved in the case. Sitting across the aisle was a woman wearing a police uniform. She looked older, maybe in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense expression etched onto her face. This officer, known for her tough reputation, had been called to testify in an unrelated matter. But something about the man sitting diagonally from her caught her eye. To her, he didn't look like someone who belonged in the courtroom. Her mind quickly jumped to conclusions. She assumed he must be connected to the defendant somehow, as the minutes ticked by. The man leaned forward slightly to speak with the person next to him. It was nothing unusual, a simple gesture really, but it set off alarm bells in the officer's head. To her it seemed aggressive, almost confrontational. Without thinking twice, she shot up from her seat, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room. "You," she shouted, pointing a finger directly at him. "Sit down and show some respect." Everyone turned to look at her, startled. The man raised his hand slightly, clearly confused. Before anyone could react, the officer marched over to where he was standing. With surprising speed, she grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back into his chair. The sudden physical contact caused chaos. Gasps filled the room and people began talking all at once. The bailiffs rushed forward, stepping between the two to separate them. One of them firmly told the officer to step back, while another asked the man if he was okay. By now, the entire courtroom was in disarray. People were standing up, craning their necks to see what was happening. The judge hadn't even entered yet, but the scene unfolding was enough to make everyone forget why they were there in the first place. The man, still composed despite the unexpected turn of events, straightened his tie and took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, looking directly at the officer. Then addressing the room, he added, "For your information, I'm here today in my capacity as the newly appointed head of the police department." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled toward the officer, whose face went pale. If the situation hadn't already been dramatic enough, this revelation made things even more surreal. The very person she had accused and physically confronted was none other than her new boss. Not only that, but he was the first person of color to hold such a high-ranking position in the city's history. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was an officer whose job was to uphold justice, and yet she had acted impulsively based on prejudice. The weight of her mistake hit her immediately. She froze, unable to say anything, as realization dawned on those around her. The murmurs grew louder, turning into full-blown chatter as people pieced together what had just happened. Outside the courtroom, reporters waiting for updates on the trial quickly picked up on the commotion inside. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with reactions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Videos taken by bystanders showed snippets of the altercation, capturing the moment when the officer lunged at the man. Comment sections exploded with debates about accountability, bias, and systemic issues within law enforcement. Back inside, the judge finally arrived, taking in the scene before him. After slamming his gavel several times to restore order, he demanded an explanation. The man calmly reiterated his introduction, emphasizing his role as the new leader of the police force. He then requested that the officer be removed from the proceedings due to her unprofessional behavior. The judge agreed, ordering her to leave the courtroom under the watchful eyes of the bailiffs. As she walked out, heads bowed in shame, the man remained standing, unfazed. Despite the disruption, he exuded confidence and authority. Those who knew him weren't surprised. He had always been someone who handled challenges with grace. For those meeting him for the first time, however, this incident left a lasting impression. It wasn't every day you witnessed someone rise above such blatant disrespect with poise and dignity. By the end of the day, the courtroom drama had become national news. Headlines blared phrases like, "Officer attacks new police chief" and "Misjudgment leads to chaos." The story resonated deeply with many, highlighting the ongoing struggles against bias and discrimination. For communities that had long felt unheard, it was both shocking and validating to see such an incident play out publicly. And so, the stage was set for what would become a pivotal moment, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire city. What started as a routine court appearance had spiraled into something far bigger, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about perception, power, and prejudice. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test relationships, challenge beliefs, and ultimately pave the way for meaningful change. The courtroom was still buzzing after the shocking revelation. The man who had been grabbed and accused by the officer stood tall, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the chaos that had erupted around him. He took a step forward, adjusting his tie once more, as if to signal that he wasn't going to let this moment define him, or worse, intimidate him. With a steady voice, he addressed the room again, this time with even more clarity. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, looking directly at the judge but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am here today not just as a private citizen, but in my official capacity as the newly appointed head of this city's police department, and the person who just attacked me." He paused, glancing toward the door where the officer had been escorted out. "Will report directly to me starting next week." The silence that followed was deafening. People exchanged wide-eyed looks, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering urgently to their neighbors. Even the bailiffs, usually stoic and professional, couldn't hide their surprise. One of them muttered under his breath, "Wow, this is unreal." For the officer, it must have felt like the floor had fallen out from beneath her feet. She had stormed into the situation thinking she was enforcing order, only to realize she had made a catastrophic mistake. The irony was almost too much to bear, for both her and the audience watching the drama unfold. Judge Roberts, now fully briefed on the situation, didn't waste any time addressing the issue. Slamming his gavel down hard, he declared, "This kind of behavior has no place in my courtroom, or anywhere else for that matter. Officer, you are suspended pending further investigation. Bailiff, please ensure she leaves the premises immediately." As the officer was led away, her face flushed with embarrassment, the tension in the room began to ease slightly. But the ripple effects of what had happened were far from over. Reporters stationed outside the courthouse caught wind of the incident almost instantly. Within minutes, cameras were rolling, microphones were thrust into the faces of anyone leaving the building, and questions flew fast and furious. What happened in there? Is it true an officer attacked someone? Who is this new police chief? By evening, the story had gone viral. News outlets across the country picked up the details, running headlines that painted the scene in vivid strokes. "Officer assaults new police chief," and "Shocking courtroom incident exposes bias." Social media platforms exploded with reactions. Memes and jokes about the incident flooded timelines, while hashtags like "Siren Cop Fails" and "Our New Chief Wins" trended nationwide. But not all reactions were lighthearted. Many people expressed outrage over the officer's actions, calling them a blatant example of prejudice and systemic racism within law enforcement. Others pointed out how such incidents eroded public trust in the police force. Community leaders seized the opportunity to demand accountability, organizing protests outside the police station and demanding reforms. That night, news anchors dissected the incident on live television. Analysts debated whether the officer's actions were a result of implicit bias or outright hostility. Some defended her, arguing that it was simply a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Others dismissed these arguments, pointing out that the officer hadn't taken a moment to assess the situation before acting aggressively. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the storm returned home to find his phone buzzing nonstop. Messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers offering support. His wife greeted him at the door, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, pulling him into a hug. He nodded, letting out a long sigh. "I'm fine." he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he recounted the day's events, his frustration evident. "It's exhausting," he admitted. "Every time something like this happens, it feels like we're taking 2 steps backward instead of moving forward." His wife listened intently, nodding along. She understood the weight of what he carried, not just as a leader but as a symbol of hope for so many people. Being the first person of color to hold such a high-ranking position came with immense pressure. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, was scrutinized through a lens of race and expectation. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality he had chosen to embrace when he accepted the role. Outside their home, the world continued to react. Protesters gathered in front of the police station, holding signs that read, "Respect our leaders," and "Justice starts with accountability." Local activists delivered impassioned speeches, urging the community to channel its anger into action. They called for transparency in the investigation and demanded sweeping changes within the department to prevent similar incidents in the future. Back inside the house, the man's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a close friend, a fellow advocate for reform. "You handled it perfectly," the text read. "Stay strong. You're making history, even if it doesn't always feel like it." Reading those words brought a small smile to his face. He knew his friend was right. This moment, as uncomfortable and surreal as it was, presented an opportunity to lead by example, to show grace under fire, and to push for real change within the system he now led. As the hours passed, the initial shock began to settle, replaced by a sense of determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought about the officer who had attacked him, about the fear, ignorance, or prejudice that might have driven her actions. He also thought about the countless individuals who looked up to him, hoping he could be the change they desperately needed. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, criticism, and moments of doubt. But as he sat there, surrounded by loved ones and buoyed by messages of support, he reminded himself why he had taken this job in the first place. It wasn't for glory or recognition. It was to make a difference. And if today's events proved anything, it was that the work he had started was more important than ever. Little did he know, this incident would become a turning point. Not just for him personally, but for the entire city. It would spark conversations that needed to happen, force accountability where it was lacking, and ultimately pave the way for meaningful progress. For better or worse, the spotlight was on him now, and he was ready to rise to the occasion. The days following the courtroom incident felt like a whirlwind. The man at the center of it all woke up each morning to a barrage of notifications, emails, texts, calls, and social media mentions. It was overwhelming, but he had known this job wouldn't be easy. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the story would spiral into a national conversation about bias, accountability, and leadership. Outside his home, protests continued to grow. People from all walks of life gathered in front of the police station, holding signs that read, "Respect starts here and enough is enough." Some carried banners with quotes from civil rights leaders, while others simply stood in solidarity, their silence speaking volumes. The energy was palpable, a mix of frustration, hope, and determination. Local activists took turns addressing the crowd, using megaphones to amplify their voices. One speaker, a young woman with fiery passion, stepped forward and said, "This isn't just about one officer or one moment. This is about a system that has failed us time and again. We need real change, not empty promises." Her words were met with cheers and applause echoing through the streets. Inside the police department, things were equally tense. Officers whispered among themselves during breaks, unsure of what to say or how to act. Some defended their colleague, insisting she'd made an honest mistake. Others kept quiet, knowing full well that her actions reflected poorly on the entire force. Morale was low, and trust between the community and law enforcement seemed more fragile than ever. Meanwhile, news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. Talk shows invited experts to analyze the incident from every angle. Was it a case of implicit bias, a breakdown in training, or something deeper rooted in systemic issues? Pundits debated back and forth, often missing the human element of the situation entirely. For the man at the heart of it all, watching these discussions felt surreal. He knew the reality was far messier and far more personal than any soundbite could capture. At home, his wife tried her best to shield him from the noise. She turned off the TV whenever sensational headlines popped up and encouraged him to take long walks to clear his mind. But even she couldn't protect him from everything. Friends called constantly, sharing stories of how the incident had sparked conversations in their own circles. Strangers approached him at grocery stores and gas stations, thanking him for staying calm under pressure. Each interaction reminded him of the weight of his role, not just as a leader but as a symbol of progress. One evening, after another long day of meetings and interviews, he sat down with his wife at the dinner table. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator in the background. He picked at his food, lost in thought. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she said gently. "Let people help you." He looked up, surprised by her candor. "I'm not trying to do it alone," he replied. "But I feel like everyone expects me to have all the answers, like I'm supposed to fix decades of problems overnight." She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "No one expects miracles," she said. "What they want is honesty. They want to see someone who understands their pain and is willing to work toward solutions, even if those solutions take time." Her words stayed with him long after the meal ended. That night, lying awake in bed, he replayed the day's events in his mind. He thought about the protesters outside, their voices filled with both anger and hope. He thought about the officers inside the department, many of whom were good people caught in a flawed system. And he thought about the woman who had attacked him, about the fear or ignorance that might have driven her actions. The next morning, he decided to visit the protest site personally. It wasn't part of his official schedule, but he felt it was important to show his support. When he arrived, the crowd erupted into applause. Some people rushed forward to shake his hand, while others simply stared in awe. He climbed onto a makeshift stage, borrowing a megaphone from one of the organizers. "I came here today because I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "Thank you for standing up, for speaking out, and for demanding better. I know it hasn't been easy. None of this has been easy. But let me tell you something. Your voices matter. Your courage inspires me every single day." The crowd cheered, but he held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "Change won't happen overnight," he continued. "It never does. But together we can build a future where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. That's my promise to you. And I need your help to make it happen." His speech was short but powerful, leaving many in tears. Afterward, he spent hours talking to individuals, listening to their stories and concerns. Some shared painful memories of encounters with law enforcement, while others expressed gratitude for his willingness to listen. By the end of the day, he felt drained, but also inspired. These were the people he served, and their voices would guide him moving forward. Back at the office, internal investigations were underway. The officer involved had been placed on administrative leave pending disciplinary action. Meanwhile, the department launched its own review of policies and procedures, focusing on areas like bias training and de-escalation techniques. The man overseeing these efforts knew it wouldn't be enough to simply implement new rules. Real change required a shift in mindset. He called a meeting with senior staff, urging them to lead by example. "We can't expect our officers to treat the public with respect if we don't model that behavior ourselves," he told them. "This starts at the top, with us. If we want to rebuild trust, we have to earn it." His words resonated with some, though others remained skeptical. Change was hard, especially in an institution as entrenched as law enforcement. But he refused to give up. Every small victory, a successful community outreach program, a positive interaction between an officer and a resident, gave him hope. As weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy surrounding the courtroom incident began to die down. Yet its impact lingered. Conversations about bias and accountability became part of everyday discourse, both within the department and beyond. The man found himself fielding fewer angry calls and more constructive suggestions. People were starting to believe that change was possible, not because he promised perfection, but because he showed up consistently, listened intently, and worked tirelessly. One afternoon, he received a letter from a young boy who had attended one of the protests. Inside was a simple drawing, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow-colored sun. At the bottom, the child had written, "Thank you for making our city safer." The man smiled, taping the picture to the wall behind his desk. It was a reminder of why he did what he did, not for recognition or praise, but for moments like this. Moments that proved, even in the face of adversity, progress was possible. And so, the journey continued. The road ahead was long, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but with each step, the man grew more determined to leave behind a legacy of fairness, compassion, and justice. Little did he know, the hardest battles were yet to come. But armed with resilience and unwavering belief in the power of unity, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The weeks following the courtroom incident were a blur of activity for the man at the center of it all. He woke up each morning with a sense of purpose, but also a weight on his shoulders. The spotlight hadn't dimmed. If anything, it had grown brighter. Every decision he made, every statement he gave was scrutinized, not just by the public, but by his colleagues, the media, and even strangers online. It was exhausting, but he knew this was part of the job he had signed up for. 1. Evening. After another long day of meetings and interviews, he sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the ceiling fan above him. His wife knocked softly before entering, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. She placed one on the desk in front of him and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sipped their tea, letting the silence settle between them. "You've been carrying a lot lately," she finally said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. He nodded, setting the mug down gently. "It's not just the work," he admitted. "It's everything. People look at me like I'm supposed to have all the answers, like I can fix years of broken trust overnight." She tilted her head, studying him carefully. "Do you feel like you're failing?" "No," he replied quickly, then paused. "Well, maybe sometimes, not because I'm not trying, I am, but because no matter what I do, there will always be someone who thinks it's not enough. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if they're right." Her eyes softened. "You're human," she reminded him. "You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to not know everything. What matters is that you keep going even when it feels impossible." Her words lingered in the air, grounding him in a way he desperately needed. He realized how easy it was to lose sight of himself in the chaos, to forget that behind the title and the expectations, he was still just a person doing his best. Meanwhile, the officer involved in the altercation was grappling with her own storm of emotions. Suspended without pay and facing an internal investigation, she spent most of her days isolated, avoiding contact with friends and family. The shame of her actions weighed heavily on her, making it hard to face anyone. When she did venture out, people stared or whispered, their judgment cutting deeper than any official reprimand ever could. One afternoon, she sat alone in her living room, staring blankly at the TV. The news was playing, replaying clips of the courtroom incident over and over again. Each time she saw herself lunging at the man, a man she now knew was her new boss, her stomach churned. She turned off the television, burying her face in her hands. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her. It was a text from an old friend. "Hey, just checking in, how are you holding up?" She stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back, "Honestly, not great." To her surprise, her friend called immediately. As they talked, she found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She confessed her fears, her regrets, her anger, not just at herself but at the system that had let her believe she could act so impulsively without consequence. Her friend listened patiently, offering comfort without judgment. "You messed up," her friend said eventually. "But messing up doesn't mean it's over. You have a chance to learn from this, to grow. That's something, isn't it?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded, even though her friend couldn't see her. For the first time since the incident, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe redemption wasn't entirely out of reach. Back at the police department, tensions remained high. Officers walked on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate the shifting dynamics within the force. Some resented the reforms being introduced, seeing them as unnecessary or overly critical. Others welcomed the changes, recognizing the need for accountability and transparency. The divide was palpable, creating an atmosphere of unease. The man, leading the charge, understood the challenges better than anyone. He called a town hall meeting, inviting every member of the department to attend. When the day arrived, the room was packed. Officers filled the chairs while others stood along the walls, arms crossed, expressions guarded. Standing at the podium, he took a deep breath before speaking. "I know this hasn't been easy," he began, his voice steady but warm. "For any of us. Change never is. But we can't ignore the fact that trust has been broken, not just with the community but within our own ranks. And rebuilding that trust starts with honesty." He went on to share his own struggles, the sleepless nights, the doubts, the pressure of living up to expectations he hadn't asked for. By opening up, he hoped to create a space where others might feel comfortable doing the same. Slowly but surely, hands began to raise. At first, the questions were cautious, probing. But as the conversation continued, the tone shifted. Officers shared their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes for the future. By the end of the meeting, the mood had changed. There was still tension, yes, but there was also a sense of possibility. For the first time in weeks, people left the room feeling heard, if not entirely satisfied. Outside the department, the community was watching closely. Protesters had scaled back their demonstrations, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Instead, they channeled their energy into organizing workshops, town halls, and outreach programs aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and law enforcement. The man attended as many of these events as he could, listening intently and taking notes. At one such gathering, a young woman stood up to speak. Her voice trembled as she recounted her own experience with police officers, how she had been stopped multiple times for no apparent reason, how she had learned to fear rather than respect those sworn to protect her. When she finished, the room fell silent. The man stood slowly, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said. "I wish I could tell you it won't happen again, but I can't promise that. What I can promise is that I'll do everything in my power to make sure fewer people have to go through what you did." His response earned a round of applause, but more importantly, it earned respect. People appreciated his honesty, his willingness to admit that he didn't have all the answers. In a world where leaders often tried to project infallibility, his vulnerability stood out. As the months passed, small victories began to pile up. A new training program focused on implicit bias received positive feedback from both officers and community members. A series of town halls helped bridge gaps between the department and local residents. Even the officer suspended after the courtroom incident returned to work, albeit in a different capacity, as part of a mentorship program designed to teach younger recruits about accountability and empathy. The man overseeing these efforts knew the road ahead would still be rocky. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when progress felt impossibly slow. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that change, however incremental, was possible. Hopeful that people, flawed and imperfect as they were, could come together to build something better. And as he drove home one evening, the sun setting in hues of orange and pink, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now he was exactly where he needed to be. Months had passed since the courtroom incident, and while the initial shock had faded, its ripple effects continued to shape the city. The man at the center of it all, now firmly established as the head of the police department, had thrown himself into his work with relentless determination. Every day brought new challenges but also small victories that reminded him why he had taken on this role in the first place. One crisp morning, he stood before the entire police force in a packed auditorium. Officers filled every seat, some leaning forward attentively, others sitting back with crossed arms and skeptical expressions. He adjusted the microphone, pausing for a moment to take in the room. This wasn't just another meeting, it was an opportunity to set the tone for the future. Change isn't easy, he began, his voice steady but warm. And let's be honest, it shouldn't be. If we're serious about making things better, then we have to face hard truths. We have to admit when we've fallen short. And most importantly, we have to commit to doing better. He went on to outline a series of reforms aimed at addressing issues like bias, accountability, and community relations. New training programs would focus not only on technical skills but also on empathy and communication. Mental health resources would be expanded for officers struggling under the weight of their duties. Perhaps most controversially, stricter measures would be put in place to hold officers accountable for misconduct, including independent oversight committees. As he spoke, the reactions in the room were mixed. Some nodded along, scribbling notes or whispering approvingly to their colleagues. Others frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of outsiders reviewing their actions. But no one could deny the sincerity in his voice, or the fact that these changes were long overdue. When he finished speaking, there was a brief silence before applause broke out. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough to signal progress. As officers filed out of the auditorium, conversations buzzed around him. Some thanked him for his leadership. Others grumbled about the extra hoops they'd now have to jump through. Either way, the message was clear. Things were changing, and everyone would have to adapt. Meanwhile, the officer involved in the courtroom altercation found herself navigating uncharted territory. After completing sensitivity training and undergoing counseling sessions, she returned to work, but not in the capacity she once held. Instead, she was assigned to mentor younger recruits, tasked with teaching them lessons she had learned the hard way. At first, the assignment felt like a punishment. She bristled at the idea of being stripped of her usual responsibilities, resenting the implication that she couldn't handle fieldwork anymore. But over time, something shifted. Working closely with rookies gave her a fresh perspective. These young officers looked up to her, not because of her rank or reputation, but because she was willing to share her mistakes openly. During one session, a recruit asked her point blank, "What do you wish someone had told you when you started?" She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Then, after a deep breath, she answered honestly, "I wish someone had told me that being a good cop isn't just about following rules or enforcing laws. It's about understanding people, their fears, their struggles, their humanity. And sometimes that means admitting when you're wrong." Her words resonated with the group, sparking a lively discussion about fairness, judgment, and compassion. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose. Teaching wasn't what she had envisioned for her career, but it was meaningful in ways she hadn't anticipated. Outside the department, the community remained engaged. Activists who had led protests earlier in the year transitioned into advocacy, groups working alongside the police to implement reforms. Regular town hall meetings became a staple, drawing crowds eager to voice concerns, offer suggestions, or simply listen. The man leading the department attended as many of these gatherings as possible, determined to maintain open lines of communication. At one such meeting, an elderly woman stood up to speak. Her voice quivered as she recounted decades of feeling unsafe in her own neighborhood, not because of crime but because of encounters with officers who treated her with suspicion rather than respect. When she finished, the room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The man stepped forward, his expression solemn. "Thank you for sharing your story," he said. "No one should feel afraid of those who are supposed to protect them. That's not justice. That's failure. And I promise you, we will keep working until that fear is gone." His response earned nods of approval from the audience, but more importantly, it reinforced his commitment to listening. Change didn't happen overnight, but each conversation brought them closer to a solution. Back at headquarters, internal investigations concluded with recommendations for disciplinary action against the officer involved in the courtroom incident. While some called for termination, others argued that firing her would send the wrong message, that redemption wasn't possible. In the end, a compromise was reached. She would retain her position but remain under close supervision, with mandatory check-ins and ongoing training. Publicly, she issued an apology during a press conference organized by the department. Standing behind a podium, flanked by senior officials, she read from a prepared statement. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, her voice cracking at times. "I made a terrible mistake," she admitted. "I acted based on assumptions instead of facts, and in doing so I betrayed the trust placed in me as an officer. To the individual I wronged, and to the community at large, I am deeply sorry. I'm committed to learning from this experience and becoming part of the solution." The apology drew mixed reactions. Some dismissed it as insincere, accusing her of trying to save face. Others saw it as a genuine step toward healing. The man overseeing the department accepted her apology graciously, emphasizing that true progress required giving people second chances, even when those chances came at great personal cost. As weeks turned into months, the city began to see tangible results. Crime rates dropped slightly, thanks in part to improved community policing efforts. Trust between residents and law enforcement showed signs of improvement, though mistrust lingered in certain areas. Still, even small wins mattered. They proved that change, however incremental, was possible. For the man leading the charge, the journey was far from over. Each victory came with its own set of challenges. Each setback demanded resilience. Yet he remained steadfast, driven by the belief that leadership wasn't about wielding power. It was about inspiring hope. Late one evening, as he sat in his office reviewing reports, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "How's it going?" she asked. He smiled faintly, typing back, "Slowly, but surely." It was a simple response, but it summed up everything. Progress wasn't always flashy or immediate. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, like the turning of seasons. And for now, that was enough. The months rolled by and the city began to feel different. Not perfect, far from it, but there was a sense that something was shifting. The man at the helm of the police department noticed it in small ways. A shopkeeper waving hello instead of looking away nervously. A teenager stopping to chat with an officer instead of crossing the street to avoid them. Community members staying after town hall meetings just to share a kind word or two. These moments weren't loud or flashy, but they were proof that change, however slow, was taking root. Inside the department, morale improved bit by bit. Officers started participating more actively in training sessions, asking questions, sharing experiences, and even challenging old habits they'd never questioned before. Some still grumbled about the new rules and oversight committees, but others admitted privately that they felt better equipped to handle tough situations. One veteran cop summed it up during a break. "It's not easy, but I sleep easier knowing we're trying to do right." For the officer who had caused the courtroom incident, life remained complicated. She wasn't the same person she'd been before that day. Her reputation had taken a hit, and some colleagues treated her differently, some with pity, others with disdain. But she kept showing up, day after day, determined to rebuild trust. Mentoring young recruits turned out to be her saving grace. Watching their faces light up when she shared stories of lessons learned and mistakes corrected gave her a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, after a particularly lively mentoring session, a rookie approached her hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" he said, fidgeting with his notebook. She nodded, curious. "Sure. What's on your mind?" He took a deep breath. "How do you know when you've crossed the line? It's like, how do you stop yourself from making assumptions like, Well, like you did. Her chest tightened for a moment, but she forced herself to smile. That's a good question, she replied. And honestly, there's no magic answer. All you can do is stay aware of your thoughts, your biases, your actions. When you catch yourself jumping to conclusions, pause. Ask yourself why you're thinking that way. And don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong. It's not weakness, it's growth. The rookie nodded thoughtfully, jotting down notes. As she walked away, she realized something. She might never fully repair the damage she'd done, but helping others avoid the same pitfalls was its own kind of redemption. Outside the department, the community continued to push for progress. Activists organized workshops where residents and officers worked side by side on projects like neighborhood cleanups and youth mentorship programs. At first, these collaborations felt awkward. People were polite but distant, unsure of how to interact. Over time, though, barriers began to crumble. Conversations flowed more naturally. Laughter replaced tension, and relationships formed organically. At one such event, a community garden project, a young mother struck up a conversation with an officer while planting flowers. They talked about their kids, their favorite foods, and eventually their fears. I used to hate seeing uniforms, she admitted, but now I see people instead of badges. The officer smiled, brushing dirt off his hands. That means a lot. Thank you for saying that. Moments like these didn't make headlines, but they mattered deeply. They reminded everyone involved that real change happened not in grand gestures, but in everyday interactions. Back at home, the man leading the department found himself reflecting often. Late nights became his sanctuary, a time to think without interruptions. His wife would join him sometimes, sitting quietly beside him as he stared out the window. On one such night, she broke the silence. "You've changed," she said softly. "Not just because of this job, but because of everything it's taught you." He glanced at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "You're tougher now, more patient too, but also softer somehow. Like you understand things on a deeper level." He chuckled, shaking his head. "If anything, I feel like I understand less than ever. This job has shown me how messy and complicated everything is. There are no easy answers. But you keep going anyway," she pointed out. "That says something." Her words stayed with him long after she left the room. He realized she was right. He had grown, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to live with uncertainty. Leadership wasn't about having a perfect plan. It was about taking steps forward, even when the path was unclear. By the end of the year, the city marked a milestone. Crime rates had dropped significantly, and surveys showed a slight increase in public trust toward law enforcement. Local newspapers ran features highlighting the progress, praising both the department and the community for their efforts. The man leading the charge received awards and accolades, but he brushed them off modestly. "This isn't about me," he told reporters. "It's about all of us working together." Still, he knew the work wasn't done. For every success story, there were setbacks. Officers resisting reforms, residents skeptical of promises, tensions flaring despite best intentions. Yet each challenge only strengthened his resolve. Change wasn't linear. It was messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating. But it was worth it. As winter settled over the city, the man stood outside the police station, watching snowflakes drift lazily to the ground. A group of officers nearby laughed as they shoveled the walkway, their breath visible in the cold air. Across the street, a family bundled in coats passed by, the children tossing snowballs at each other. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from a community leader. "Thanks for sticking with us through all of this. We couldn't have done it without you." He smiled faintly, typing back, "Thank you for believing in us. That's what makes this possible." Putting the phone away, he took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. The road ahead would still be bumpy, full of challenges and doubts. But for now, he allowed himself to feel proud, not of any single achievement, but of the collective effort that had brought them this far. Change wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, about showing up even when it was hard, about learning, growing, and finding hope in the smallest victories. And as he turned ahead, back inside, ready to face whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain. They were on the right path.